Howdy everyone, and today I'm checking out another new lens from Venus Optics with a shift function, their Laowa 20mm f4.0D shift lens. It is a totally manual, full-frame lens for digital SLR cameras, although the version you see here is a special one for Sony's E-mount mirrorless cameras with a built-in adapter at the back, making it a little longer than one of their models for digital SLRs. It costs about $1,100 in the US or £1,150 in the UK. Sounds like a lot of money, but it's about half the price of Canon's 17mm tilt shift lens and only a third the price of Nikon's 19mm tilt shift lens, although this Laowa option does not feature a tilt function. I'd like to thank Venus Optics for providing this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. Many of you will already know what a shift lens is by now, but here's a recap just in case. The shift function here, up to 11mm on this lens, enables you to correct your perspective for architecture photography or any other kind of photography where keeping straight lines straight is important. Yes, you can do this to your pictures in editing software too, but that will degrade your final image quality quite a bit, and there's nothing quite like getting it right when you're there in the field. You can also rotate this lens so that it shifts from left to right or any angle in between. And another neat trick is that the shift function can be used to make easily stitchable panorama images. Just shift the lens all the way to the left, take a shot, and then to the right, take another shot, and make sure to keep the exposure the same by shooting in manual mode, then stitch the pictures together in editing for a high resolution panorama. Neat! Available separately for a little over £200, Laowa also make this interesting lens support cage, which also works with their 15mm shift lens. It works by attaching the front of your lens to the tripod rather than the camera itself, and allows you to easily rotate your camera for panorama shots of different kinds, with the precision and simplicity that allows you to stitch the shots together very easily, even in Microsoft Paint if you want to. It's an expensive accessory for sure, but it has excellent build quality, turning fantastically smoothly with no slack in its movements, and it could be useful for particularly exacting landscape and architecture photographers. My only complaint about it is that this hole in the tripod mount is not screw threaded, although it looks like it should be. It's an Arca Swiss mount, so you'll need to check that that works with your tripod. But even without that interesting device, the lens's shift function is pretty useful for architecture or landscape photography, especially considering this lens's very wide angle of 20mm. As I mentioned, this lens does not feature a tilt function. That's mostly used for professional product photography though, which is hardly a priority on a wide 20mm lens, so Venus Optics just about gets away with that one, I think. When it comes to build quality, this lens is excellent. It's very solid, very metallic, and easy to use. It's also a bit smaller than competing tilt shift lenses that are on the market, which are generally gigantic. It's based on a metal lens mount, which does not have a weather sealing gasket around it. At the rear come the controls for the shift mechanism, and they are well designed. The shift mechanism can be locked in place with a little metal knob, and a control ring lets you adjust the shift action very precisely. Just behind that is a switch which lets you rotate the shift mechanism, locking it in place every 15 degrees. Sandwiched between the shift control ring and the focus ring comes a rather narrow aperture control ring, which clicks into place every f-stop. The aperture mechanism has 14 straight-cut iris blades, and in front of that comes a focus ring with a hyperfocal distance scale, which turns incredibly smoothly and slightly heavily and is nice and precise to use. As you change focus, the lens displays very little focus breathing, so that'll be helpful for anyone doing some unusual video work. The lens comes with a special metallic hood which screws into place, and when it is in place you can still turn the hood around to stop it getting in the way when you're doing shift photography. It has an 82mm filter size as well, which is very useful for landscape photography, getting some screw-in filters on there. Overall, this is a well-built, tough, manual focus lens, and as I mentioned, it's also smaller than the more expensive tilt-shift lenses out there. It's fairly easy to handle. Now onto image quality. I'm testing it on my Sony a7R III with its full frame 42 megapixel sensor. Firstly, let's test the lens normally, unshifted. In the middle of the image at f4, sharpness is quite good, with good contrast. The image corners look softer, definitely, but not dreadfully so. Stop down to f5.6 for a small improvement in the corners, and even more sharpness in the middle. f8 looks just as fantastic in the middle. The corners look a bit sharper though. They stay this sharp down to f11. Overall, I was hoping for a bit more corner sharpness here, but contrast is good and chromatic aberration is largely under control. Now, let's shift the lens all the way up to its extreme and see what happens. In the middle of the image at f4, picture quality is soft with lower contrast and clear astigmatism. There's more horizontal resolution than vertical, which is kind of what you tend to expect from a lens that's been shifted actually. In the corner that's been stretched the least, we still see softness, but a lot more contrast. The corner that's been stretched the most seems to offer better sharpness here, but it's pretty dark, as you might expect. Stop down to f5.6 and things are clearer and a lot sharper in that stretched corner now, and the corner that's been stretched the least sees a small improvement also. The middle of the image sees more clarity now, although things are still a bit fuzzy there. Stop down to f8 and the middle looks fairly good, albeit still with somewhat low contrast. The least stretched corner now looks very sharp. The most stretched corner looks fantastic too. At f11, the corners remain as sharp as ever, but stop down any further, say to f16 or f22, and the image really begins to lose contrast and resolution. Well, what a rollercoaster ride that was. Unsurprisingly, as we've seen, shifting the lens brings in a considerable penalty for image quality. It is important to note, once again, that even the best shift lenses show these kind of image quality problems when fully shifted. You should avoid shifting this lens and shooting at f4, but stop down only to f5.6 or especially f8 for a big improvement in image quality, even in the most stretched, shifted corners. Alright, let's move on and take a look at distortion and vignetting. When a lens is unshifted, we are treated to almost no distortion and only slightly dark corners at f4. Stop down to f5.6 and they brighten up again. Now, let's shift the lens. We notice a slight stretching to the distortion pattern now, but it's nowhere near as bad as I expected. It's still mostly under control. There's a lot more darkness in the top of the image though, where the image has been stretched the most. Stop down to f5.6 or f8 or f11 to see that slowly get pushed higher up, but it'll always be there, at least just a little. Now, let's take a look at close-up image quality. This thing can focus down to 25 centimeters, just about close enough for smaller subjects. Close-up image quality at the maximum aperture of f4 is a little softer than before, but still good enough. Stop down to f5.6 to see an immediate increase in sharpness and contrast though. Now, let's take a look at how the lens works against bright lights. It's a slightly below average performance here, although not too bad. Contrast remains good, but there's some clear circular flaring patterns which could suggest that the inner barrel of the lens could have been flocked a little better. Now let's take a look at coma levels. It's good news here. Even straight at f4, the lens shows no coma smearing on bright points of light. Let's zoom out and look for sun stars. Stop down to f5.6 and they begin to emerge already, and from there, the more you stop down, from f8 to f11 to f16 to f22, the better and bolder they get, looking pretty incredible actually. And finally, bokeh. Unless you're getting very close to your subject, then background separation is a bit of a moot point here, but generally, out-of-focus backgrounds are rendered averagely smoothly whenever you can get them, but occasionally with a little edge to them. Well, that lens took a while for me to test out. Overall, its image quality is quite average for a shift lens. Basically, it's usable enough at brighter apertures, but for good quality overall, you need to stop it down to f8 or f11, where it can get you some great images. It certainly costs far less than the tilt-shift lenses that Canon and Nikon offer, although obviously the lack of a tilt function somewhat accounts for that price difference. While we're here, let's briefly see how it compares to its older brother, Laowa's 15mm f4.5 shift lens. Looking back and comparing my test results, I found that the 15mm lens was slightly sharper when shooting without any shift, and the newer 20mm lens a tiny bit sharper shooting while shifted. The older 15mm lens can shoot more closely to your subject, which is nice, but the 20mm lens displays less flaring. Both lenses display remarkably little distortion, which is great. I do prefer the wider angle of the more ambitious 15mm lens in general, but the 20mm lens can use screw-in filters, which is particularly useful for landscape photography, and I prefer the look of its sun stars too. Both lenses have their strengths and weaknesses here, but ultimately, if you are on the market for a shift lens and 20mm is your bag, then this model is worth consideration. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's my pleasure to put these reviews together for everyone. If you find them helpful, then feel free to check out my Patreon page, where you can find all kinds of exclusive content and videos and sneak previews for anyone who'd like to support the channel for only $3 a month. It's not just about increasing my personal beer fund, it does make a real difference to keeping these tests going, and thank you so much for the support, all the people who are currently on there. Take care everyone.